This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Bruchim Abam, welcome everyone. Parshas Vayeitzey. Very interesting subject tonight. Somewhat of a controversial topic and a topic of great historical interest. And that is, in general, the source of the correct pronunciation of words. You know, we have Shulchan Aruch to tell us about our daily practice, about how do you get up in the morning, how you get dressed, how you daven, how you observe Shabbos, how you observe Yom Tif, laws of family ritual, and so on and so forth. But in terms of the pronunciation of the words, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't really teach us how to pronounce words or what the correct vocalization and enunciation of various words in Tanakh is. And interestingly, while we have many different categories of great Chachamim in our history, be it Nevi'im, Chachamim, Rishonim, Achronim, Gaonim, but none of these categories really describe the Chacham that is required to be able to offer educated opinion regarding the correct dikduk and pronunciation of words. And we're about to be introduced to really a new category of Chachamim tonight, and these are the Medaktikim, those who are expert in dikduk, in the correct pronunciation, grammar, vocalization of Hebrew words. And it really goes to show that somebody could be a renowned Talmud Chacham, and somebody could be very learned in halacha and in Gemara, and really have absolutely no clue how to read a single Hebrew word. And vice versa. One could be very well versed in Hebrew vocalization and be an Amma Aretz D'Oraisa. So these are two really separate disciplines, and the Talmud Chacham really needs to be knowledgeable in both. In terms of the right amount of each, you know, the phrase of the Chavos Yair is aptly used, and that is, dikduk is like mustard, and that is, a little bit is good. Okay, so in fulfilling a little bit is good, we're going to discuss some of the interesting historical debates about reading in general, and specific to this week's Parsha. Okay, so the Rambam in the Yad HaChazak and Hilchos Sefer Torah and Parak Ches, the Rambam says there's great confusion and great vagueness and unclarity regarding when writing Sefer Torah, what is the correct way to write a Sefer Torah in terms of spaces and closing up. In other words, we know there are psuchais and stumais. Some Parshas in the Torah there are spaces, some Parshas in the Torah are sealed up, and obviously we don't have any. It's not written in the Chumash. Okay, make a pause, continue. This is all part of the Torah Shabbat Peh. And there was a lot of dissension and a lot of disagreement regarding how to do this, and a lot of confusion, and therefore the Rambam wanted to codify for all time the definitive way to write a Sefer Torah. So the Rambam is bothered. And where did I get it from? In other words, I'm going to tell you how to write a Sefer Torah. Where am I getting my information from? So the Rambam says, I'll tell you where I'm getting it from. The Rambam says, V'sefer shesamachnu ala b'dvar me'elo. The scroll that we rely on for these matters, Hu HaSefer HaYadua b'Mitzrayim, was the well-known scroll in Egypt, which includes all 24 books, which was originally in Yerushalayim for many years, from which all the Sfarim were corrected from, and everyone relied on that Sefer that was in Yerushalayim, that was then later moved to Mitzrayim. And who says this is a reliable Sefer? Says the Rambam, Hakol Soimchin Lefi Shehigiu Ben Asher, because it was corrected by the great Ben Asher. Anyone here today named Asher? Yoshua Asher. Yeah? Okay, so you're Ben Asher. Ben Asher corrected this particular Sefer Torah. V'dikduku by Shanim Harbe. And he was very precise and careful in editing this work. V'higiu pamim rabbis. And he went through it many, many times. K'may shetiku. Va'alav samachti b'sefer Torah shekasavti, and I relied on the Sefer Torah in Egypt. And what's so special about that? It was edited and corrected and checked and honed by this great personage named Ben Asher. Now, most people never heard of Ben Asher. Yeah. Most people have heard of Reb Sadia Gaon, or Rashi, or the Rambam, or the Vilna Gaon, or the Chassam Sofer. But most people never heard of Ben Asher, and yet the Rambam is saying when it comes to writing a Sefer Torah, all Sifrei Torah now in the world need to be modeled after the Sefer Torah of Ben Asher. Who's Ben Asher? The Radak, in his Akdama to Sefer Shorashim, he writes, V'chein asker tzas machloikes Ben Asher u Ben Naftali. Anyone here named Naftali tonight? Nobody yet. Okay. So now, not only are we being introduced to someone by the name of Ben Asher, now we're being introduced to Ben Naftali. And says the Radak, Rav David Kimchi, I'm going to mention some of the machlokes between Ben Asher and Ben Naftali. And who do we rely on when there's a machlokes Ben Asher and Ben Naftali? We always rely on Ben Asher. Ben Asher takes the day. Ben Asher is the king when it comes to dikduk. The Radak also writes in Tehillim, Parak Samach Beis, Pasuk Daled, Va'anu soimchim al kriyas Ben Asher. We always rely on the reading of Ben Asher. Okay, so now we know there's somebody by the name of Ben Asher. Who was he? When did he live? One thing we know for sure, he lived before the Rambam and the Radak. Yeah? And on the other hand, he had a counterpart who he disagreed with, and his name was Ben Naftali. Okay, now interestingly, comes the Sefer Torah of Rabbi Menachem di Luntzano, and he presents to us, and he lived after the Rambam, and he writes that the first dispute between Ben Naftali and Ben Asher is in the third pasuk in the Chumash. The third pasuk in the Chumash says like this: Vayomer Elokim Yehi Ayr Vayehi Ayr. So now let's analyze the trup on Vayomer Elokim. Vayomer Elokim Mercha Tibcha. Vayomer Elokim. Now a tibcha is a pause, is a melech. You must pause after a tibcha. If you read it, Vayomer Elokim Yehi Ayr, so you're not doing anything. You're just, you're just mumbling through. You're not following the halacha. The halacha is, the Mishnah Berurah says, if you run over a tibcha, bevadai machzirin oisa, you have to stop the guy. So why don't we stop the guy? Because then we would be here all day. Okay? But ideally, we need to put up a balkorei who actually knows what a mercha is and knows what a tibcha is and knows you have to pause by a tibcha. Vayomer Elokim, pause. Now, what is the trup on the word yehi? Yehi are. There is no trup on yehi. No, what are you talking about? It's a major machlokes what the trup is on yehi. What? The Torah says, the trup is b'shoifar yashar. There's a munach. Vayomer Elokim yehi are. There's a munach under the word yehi. But v'loi b'makaf, not with a dash. Now, without getting personal, in the Art Scroll Chumash, there's a dash. I love Art Scroll, but it's not correct. There should not be a dash there. What should there be? There should be a munach. Says the Art Torah v'zuhi plukta rishayna shebein Ben Asher ben Naftali. That's the first dispute between Ben Asher and Ben Naftali. Ben Asher says it's a munach. Ben Naftali says it's a dash. The Art Scroll goes like Ben Naftali. The Simonim, the Tikkun Simonim, got it right. They go like Ben Asher. The Mikrois Gedolos got it right. They go like Ben Asher. So you should know, if you want to know whether the Chumash I'm using is an accurate Chumash, all you need to do is open up the third pasuk. If there is a munach, it's got a chance to be accurate. If it's a dash, you could use it to follow the Kriyas HaTorah, but if you need to be medakdek, you use something. A dash is a makaf. Right after Vayomer Elokim Yehi dash ar, there's a dash in the Chumash. A little dash between the two words. Yehi ar and ar. There's a makaf. No, it doesn't. It doesn't have. It doesn't have ramifications for today's shir. But it's a different shrub. There's a makaf. Okay. Says the Art Torah. Ben Naftali says Yehi b'makaf. V'noagu kol Yisrael b'glilois ha'elu lismoich al kriyas Ben Asher. The minhag of Klal Yisrael and these little cows is to follow Ben Asher. Keilu yotza bas koil, like a heavenly voice came out. Va'amra Ben Asher, Ben Naftali, halacha ke Ben Asher. It's as if a heavenly voice cried out that whenever there's a dispute between Ben Asher and Ben Naftali, we follow Ben Asher. So it's like God Almighty called out from heaven, Vayomer Elokim Yehi with a munach ar, but not Vayomer Elokim Yehi makaf ar. Okay, that's what the Our Torah concludes. Enters the Mincha Shai. Now, I don't think we ever mentioned the Mincha Shai in any of our Wednesday night shiurim. The Mincha Shai is considered the final word on all pronunciation of words. The Mincha Shai was written by a great rabbi of Mantua named Rabbi Yedidia Shloimeh Nortzi. Do you know anybody with the last name named Nortzi? No, you don't. Okay? Now you know him. Rabbi Yedidia Shloimeh Nortzi, who lived from 1560 to 1626. He was a Rav in Mantua, Italy, from the year 1600 to 1626. Says the Heilige Sam Sofer in Tshuva 270 in Yeridea. My Rabbeim always relied on the Mincha Shai. What do they have?
He has 2 dashes, and Art Scroll only has 1 dash.
Okay, good. So hopefully you'll find the 3rd Chumash, okay? But those are not accurate, okay? The Tikkun Simanim is accurate. Tikkun Simanim has emunach. Fine. The Mincha Shai is the final Aruch HaShulchan writes in Siman Reish Ayin Hey Sif Tezvav, not on your sheet, that we always rely on the Mincha Shai. Mincha Shai is the final word. You know, you want to know, how do you pronounce in the Haftarah of Lech Lecha? V'koyeh Hashem Yachalifu. So some Balikar will say V'koyvei. That's not what the Mincha Shai says. Mincha Shai says V'koyeh. Who do we follow? We follow the Mincha Shai. Mincha Shai is the final word on how to pronounce words. This is not a matter of Shulchan Aruch. This is not a matter of Shas. This is not found in either. This follows the Misoiraim and the Medaktikim, and the Mincha Shai is the final word. So the Mincha Shai says like this. This is the first chiluf between Ben Asher and Ben Naftali. Yeah? This is the first chiluf between Ben Asher and Ben Naftali. What does that mean, it's the first chiluf? In the old Mikrais Gedolos Chumashim, we're going back to the year 1500. In the back of the Chumash appeared a page called Chilufim. Now the Mikrais Gedolos was printed according to Ben Asher, but Ben Naftali always argued on Ben Asher. In the back of the Mikrais Gedolos, they would print a page of discrepancies where Ben Naftali argued. But nobody's interested in that, so they don't print it anymore. But in the original Mikrais Gedolos, and you had dozens of chilufim. The first chiluf is Yehi. The word Yehi, is it a munach or is it a makaf? Okay, that's the first time they argue. Now the Mincha Shai gives us some background. Who is Ben Asher? Who is Ben Naftali? So he says there were 2 great Rosh Yeshiva. By the way, what city did they live in? What's our favorite city here?
Brooklyn.
Tiberia. They lived, all the Misoiraim, Medaktikim, they lived in Tiberia. And the Misoiraim lived in Tiberia. Ben Asher, Ben Naftali, they were Rosh Yeshiva in Tiberia. One man's name was Yaakov ben Naftali. The other man was Aaron ben Asher. And some say his name was Moshe ben Asher. Some say his name was Rav Aaron bar Moshe Mishevet Asher and Rav Moshe ben Dov Mishevet Naftali. Be it as it may, says the Mincha Shai, we rely on Ben Asher. And the Rambam relies on Ben Asher. And all Yidden in the Western world rely on Ben Asher. In the East, they rely on Ben Naftali. Says the Mincha Shai, I'm not going to repeat this again, but this is the premise of my Sefer. That whenever there's a discrepancy of how to pronounce a word, Klal Yisrael, for the most part, has accepted the opinion of Ben Asher. Okay, so now let's come to one classic machlokes between Ben Asher and Ben Naftali. And that is the word Yissachar. Anyone here named Yissachar? No? Okay. So we have no Naftalis, no Naftalis, no Yissachars, but okay, look, tonight is Ben Asher's night, we have an Asher. Okay, good. So, the word Yissachar, obviously we all know that the way it's spelled is Yud, Sin, Chaf, Resh. The question is, how is it pronounced? Comes the Ibn Ezra in the beginning of Sefer Shemais, which is certainly worthy of our attention, since this is not the first time the name Yissachar appears. The name Yissachar appears for the first time in this week's Parsha. And the Ibn Ezra says, because there are 2 consecutive sins, you do not pronounce the second one. Because whenever you have 2 syllables in a row that are very hard to distinguish between the 2 and say 2, there's a rule in Hebrew grammar, you omit the second one. Like in the pasuk in Divrei Hayamim, mechatzrim, which you pronounce mechatzrim. And therefore the way you pronounce it is Yissachar. Not for a drush reason, not for a halachic reason, for reasons of dikduk. That whenever you have 2 sins in a row, you only pronounce the first one. Now, says the Ibn Ezra, Ve'ein shin kamaya b'mikra. There's no other instance where you have two sins in a row where you encounter this difficulty. And therefore this is the only example where two sins in a row, you apply the rule that you omit the second sin. You do find this rule by two tzaddiks in a row in Divrei Hayamim. So for all you Divrei Hayamim aficionados, you remember it's not mechatzrim, but it's mechatzrim. Fine. Comes the Radak in Divrei Hayamim on the word mechatzrim. He says, Kosav v'shnei tzadi, v'rishoyna nikreis, v'ashniya eino nikreis. V'chein Yissachar, Shin rishoyna nikreis, v'ashniya eino nikreis. You say those are the only two examples? No! Remember the guy in Bereshis? Mechi Ya'el. But there are two yuds. So why don't you say it, Mechi Ya'el? You know why? Because you don't pronounce two letters in a row. What about there's another individual by the name of Yira'eya? No. Or Shlamiya? No. We omit the second yud. So too, Yissachar, says Radak, if you say Yissaschar, you're wrong. We scream at you, we throw tomatoes at you, we remove you, we take you down, and we put someone else who knows how to read the word. That's the opinion of the Ibn Ezra and the Radak.
It really doesn't matter which one you skip.
As long as you skip one of them. Yeah, you don't have to tell us. You don't have to make a commitment before which one you're skipping. In other words, you don't have to announce. By the way, this year, L'Kavod Chveis, the Marsha's Yartzeit, I'm skipping the second one this year. You don't have to announce. It's pick'em. You're a free agent. You can do whatever you want. This is the opinion of the Ibn Ezra and the Radak. Comes the Mincha Shai, who he said is the final word on dikduk, and the Mincha Shai quotes an earlier source. Now, many of the comments of the Mincha Shai, now it's interesting. The old Mikrois Gedolos used to come with the Mincha Shai in the Mikrois Gedolos. But I'll give you a little example. They just came out like a week and a half ago with a new Mikrois Gedolos. What's in the new Mikrois Gedolos? Breslov, Chabad, Arizal, Zohar. So what do you see from there? Mikrois Gedolos prints what the customer wants. Right? So it used to be that back in the day people were interested in dikduk. So the Mincha Shai was a staple of Mikrois Gedolos. Today the Mincha Shai has been supplanted by the above mentioned Mefarshim in the new Mikrois Gedolos. But Mincha Shai used to be in every Mikrois Gedolos. Now it's no longer in the Chumash, it's still in many Nevi'im. There was a great Medakdek who lived in our generation, a Yid who used to go around from shul to shul selling his farm. His name was Rabbi Yehuda Leib Gottman, Zecher Tzak Levracha, who reprinted the Mincha Shai really for the first time in many years. He was a good friend of my father. He used to like my father's Kriyas HaTorah, and he's the one who really made the Mincha Shai accessible to our generation, and this is from his edition over here. He writes, now the Mincha Shai very often quoted from earlier sources, the Ramah. Which Ramah? If you remember Masechta Baba Basra and Sanhedrin, there's something, the Yad Ramah, Rabbeinu Meir Halevi Abu Lafia. The Mincha Shai paskins for all time. Koloi Raisa train Shinin. Everywhere in the Torah, Yissachar is spelled with two shins. Ksiv train Shinin. Ksiv. Koloi Raisa train Shinin Ksiv. Chad kari bekamatz. One it has a kamatz and a v'dagish. V'chad loy kari, and the other one you don't read. So basically, at this point, it would seem case closed. There's only one way to read this word, Yissachar. This is the opinion of Ibn Ezra, Radak, and finally the Mincha Shai. But as you probably all know, you've probably all been to places where they've done a number of different possibilities. I'm sure you've heard Yissaschar. Is there any basis for that? Is it correct? Do you need to correct the person? Is it a mistake? So, but what it would seem is that according to the Medakdikim, there is no wiggle room. You may not say Yissaschar. It is Yissachar, and the second sin is what we call Kri V'loi Ksiv. And as we're going to see, the biggest raya is as follows. You could look at any Chumash in the world, Mikrois Gedolos. You could look in the Tikkun Simonim. You could look in the Korein Chumash. Not only are there no nekudos on the sin, there's no dot that even indicates that it is a sin. Wait a second. If it's pronounced Yissaschar, at the very least you need to have a dot on the left side. Why are there no dots? You know why? Because it's a Krieg sieve. That's why. So you'll say, if it's a Krieg sieve, why doesn't it say Krieg sieve? We're going to see there are a few examples of Krieg sieves that are so obvious that it doesn't need to say it. For example, many, many times you read the word he, and it's spelled Hey Vav Aleph. And it doesn't say Krieg sieve, because it's obvious. Every time the word Yerushalayim appears in Tanakh, except for one, it's spelled Yud, Reish, Vav, Shin, Lamed, Mem. So it should be read Yerushalim. Answer is it's a Krieg sieve. It's Kri with a Yud, it's Ksiv without a Yud. So why doesn't it say it? Because every Amma Aretz knows that Yerushalayim is a Krieg sieve. I mean, we need to have like in the transliterated benchers how to pronounce the words. Everybody knows Bereshis Bar Elokim. We don't have under it B-E-R, so we don't need to say Yerushalayim is a Krieg sieve. We don't need to say who is a Krieg sieve, and we don't need to say Yissachar is a Krieg sieve. But to say Yissaschar would be like reading it Yerushalim and like reading it who instead of he. That is the opinion of the Medaktikim. However, we find in this week's Parshas Vayeitzey, so Reuven was going out during the harvest, and he found jasmines in the field, and according to many Mefarshim, these jasmines were fertility-inducing herbs, and as we know, that in the family of Yaakov Avinu, there was a great rivalry, and that is who's going to have the most children. It was considered a race, it was a competition, because this is Ruchnius, Kinas Soifrim Tar B'Chachma. Leah wanted more, Rachel wanted more, everybody wanted a piece of the Shiftei Ka. So Reuven was getting in on the action, right? These steroids were not disallowed yet, it wasn't against the law. This was not unfair competition. So Reuven's looking for the jasmine, and he's about to bring jasmine to his mom, and Rachel comes, well, what do you got? What do you got in your hand? And she says, Rachel says to Leah, give me some of the dudaim. So Leah says, you have the chutzpah to take away my husband from me. Yaakov is mine, I married him first. And now you want to take away my dudaim? So Rachel said, no problem. You know what? Tonight's my night. I will sell you Yaakov Avinu tonight. You give me the jasmine, and you take the man. So Rachel said, Leah said, no problem. Here, I am renting Yaakov Avinu for some herbs. That's the story. So Yaakov comes home, and he's expecting Rachel to come out toward him. Leah said, sorry, wrong address. We have to change the address printed on the place card is wrong. We have to change tonight's address. Why? So Leah said, because I rented you. I rented you. A rental. Yeah? So God listened to Leah, and she conceived, and she had a fifth son. And Leah said, God rewarded me. Why? Because I gave Zilpah to Yaakov. Come on. That's the sanitized edition of the story. That's not what happened. Think about it. She said, I rented Yaakov. And then when she names the kid Yissachar, she says, Nasan Alekim Schari. She should have said, Nasan Alekim Schari, Ki Sachar Secharticha Yaakov Avinu. No, there's no way at the baby naming it. There's no way she's going to have in Shul, they announce that he's called Yissachar because she rented him. So she says an Eidela reason. She says that we're calling him Yissachar because God is rewarding me that I allowed Yaakov to live with Zilpah. But it comes out that there are really two rentals and two schars going on with this kid. Schar number one is Leah's being rewarded that she allowed her maidservant to live with Yaakov. That's the first schar. And the second schar is she rented Yaakov. Says the Chizkuni, wait a second, didn't Rachel also let Yaakov live with Bilhah? Yeah, Rachel did it because she didn't have any kids. But Leah had a lot of kids, so she did it as a chesed. Therefore, says the Chizkuni, you know why Yissachar has two shins? Because they're two schars. One is the rental of Yaakov, and one is the fact that Leah allowed Zilpah to live with Yaakov. Now, we could immediately understand. One of these reasons we don't mind publicizing, and one of these reasons we wouldn't mind throwing under the rug. As Leah herself did when she named the kid. She didn't announce and show when her friends came over for the Kiddush, and she was serving in the loose side over there with, those little cups with those little spoons where there's nothing in it, right? That, why'd you name him Yissachar? she's not telling the story about the rental. That's not the... So she says, God is rewarding me that I gave Zilpah. Now, by the way, the Rashbam says the same thing. The Rashbam says 2 schars, one for the Dudaim, and one that she allowed her husband, allowed Zilpah to live with Yaakov. Comes Dasakena mi balei atoisvis. This explains why one sin we pronounce, one sin we don't pronounce. The sin that God is rewarding her for allowing Yaakov to live with, Yaakov live with Zilpah, so that's public. Then we say Yissachar, we pronounce one sin. The other sin that she rented him, that's not for public consumption, and therefore we hold it under our breath. Okay, now according to that reason, you should never pronounce the sin. Not the 10th time, not the 5th time, and not the 1st time. We always want it to be hidden. But the Dasakanim brings another reason. Check out this reason. We know Yissachar had a kid. His name was Yoiv. Look at number 13. And Vayigash v'nei Yissachar toila ufuva v'yoiv v'shimrain. Look in Parshas Pinchas. Liyashuv mishpachas hayashuvi l'shimrain mishpachas hashimraini. So Shimrain, his name stays the same. Yoiv, he changed his name a little on his next social security card. You know, when he was going for his passport, he had he changed his name. Never have a different name on the passport than on the social security card. Okay, so he had a different name in Parshas Pinchas. You know, it's like the guy got called up for the Aliyah. He said, "Which name should I use?" You know, but never. So what happened to Yoiv? He became Yashuv. Rashi says he's the same guy. So how did he get the Shin? So the Chida brings from an ancient sefer called Devek Tov. The Devek Tov, Reb Shimon Halevi Aschenberg. He says, I'll tell you where he got the Shin. Don't remember in Tanakh, one of the names of Avodah Zarah was Yoiv. So Yoiv at his bris, they call him Yikar Shema B'Yisrael, Yoiv ben Yissachar, ben Yissaschar. And then he goes to kindergarten in 1st grade, and then in the yeshiva, the Rebbe is saying, Kinderlach, I want you to know that if you see a getchke called Yoiv, you gotta spit out, you gotta be mavaza it, and they're all looking at this poor kid. By recess, they're mavaza the kid, they torture the kid. The kid is being bullied. So the kid comes crying home and said, Dad, what do you do to me? Why do you give me this bad name? So Yissaschar said, you wouldn't believe it. I never knew why I had this extra tire in my back pocket. You know, I had 5 tires. I have 2 sins. I don't know what am I going to do with the second sin. Here, take this sin. You become Yashuv, I'll become Yissachar, and Shalom al Yisrael. That's what the Devek Tov brings. The Taz on Chumash and the Divrei David brings the same pshat. Comes the Nachlas Yaakov. One of the most controversial Sfarim ever written. It's so controversial, you never heard of it. You can't get it. Gedalia Schwartz, if you could get it, that would top them all. But I don't think Gedalia, this is even available. I think it was out of print. He's not here. I'm telling you, he's going to hear it tonight, later. But Amazon, I don't know. This Sefer is so controversial only because of the next paragraph. He says, if you take the gematria of Yissaschar, 830, and you subtract the word subtraction, teitzei, which is 491.
What is it? What is it?
Take 830 and subtract the word subtraction, teitzei, 430. You get Shin Lamed Tes, 339. Now, why in the world you subtract the word subtraction, he doesn't say, and I have absolutely no idea. So you subtract from Yissaschar, subtraction, you get 339. Shin is the Shin of that we remove from Yissaschar. And when do we remove it? Lamed Tes in the 39th Parsha. What's the 39th Parsha? Parshas Pinchas. Says the Nachlas Yaakov, that's right. The way you read it is, you read it Yissaschar, because that's his name. But Yissaschar eventually made a kidney donation. He gave away a Shin. He donated the Shin to Yoiv. When did he donate it? In Parsha 39, which is Parsha 39, Parsha's Pinchas. So therefore, take Yissaschar, subtraction, which is a subtraction of his Shin. You get 339. 300 is the Shin, 39 is the 39th Parsha. You have a pshat wife, so you take away subtraction? And
Shin, it's that subtraction.
Okay, fine. So he says, now why? This is all based on the Torah of the Devek Tov and the Taz, that Yissaschar had an extra Shin, and Yoav was named after, got a bad name because it's the name of Avodah Zarah. So when his name comes Yashuv, that's when you call him Yissachar. But while he's still Yoav, he's Yissaschar. That is the Mahalach of the Nachlas Yaakov, which until today, there are kehilos that follow this minhag, that they read it Yissaschar until they get to Parshas Pinchas, and in Parshas Pinchas, in Shin Lamed Tes, the 39th Parsha, they lane it Yissachar. Now, enters Reb Shlomo Zalman Hena, another name that most people never heard of. And Reb Shlomo Zalman Hena was a contemporary of Reb Yaakov Emden. It's always spelled with an extra shin. It just it was donated later. Comes Rav Shlomo Zalman Hena. Now, Klal Yisrael owes a great debt of gratitude to Rav Shlomo Zalman Hena because he was one of the people who corrected the Siddur in terms of the letters and the vocalization of words in the Siddur. This is number 20. This comes from the Sefer Sharei Tefillah of the Raza, Reb Zalman Hena, one of the most colorful personalities and strongest pens in history. Because if he disagreed with, he was a young man, he was a genius, and he was a bar plukta with Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And he was one of the greatest medaktikim of all time. We don't always agree with him, but in many ways he's considered the final word on dikduk. And he quotes this Nachlas Yaakov. And you look at number 20, we're now in the second column of the bottom paragraph. And he says, V'ata chadashim mikarayv ba'u. And nowadays, people have now come with the new fangled practices. Me'avsim hakriya nechaina, and they distort and destroy the proper reading of the Torah. And they read it Yissaschar until Parshas Pinchas. Says Reb Shlomo Zalman Hena, you know what I say about this? Next paragraph, Petume milaninu, it's rubbish. It's chatter. It's empty nothing. It must be the Nachas Yaakov had a dream, and some Navi told him in a dream that randomly in Parshas Pinchas we have to stop pronouncing it Yissaschar. He says, give me a break, he says. If his father didn't like his name, he should have gotten Aliyah and said, Vikar Shema B'Yisrael, Jeff. Why? He needed to throw in an extra shin, like he was carrying around a shin, like an extra suitcase that he just dropped off on his son's name. Kilo, let's say he didn't have the extra shin. Then the kid would be demoralized for the rest of his life. You could get a shin from anywhere. You could always throw a shin in. Why didn't you could throw in a gimel, yagov. Well, he says, a divrei nevios. It's nonsense, says Rav Shlomo Zalman Hena. And that's a nice way of interpreting what he says. Furthermore, says Reb Shlomo Zalman Hena, that's not the pshat in Yashuv. Rashi and Divrei Hayomim. The Baal HaTurim says, you know why he's called Yashuv? Because he's the son of Yissachar. And Yissachar of Bnei Yissachar, Yodei Bidim La'itim, they sat and learned Torah. So Rashi says in Divrei Hayomim, Yoav was called Yashuv, Shenes Yashvu Lilmai Torah. Not because his father was lugging around an extra shin. He said, hey kid, carry this for me. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman Hena, to say Yissaschar until Pinchas and to say Yissachar after Pinchas is wrong l'kulei alma. You know why? Because there's a famous machlokes between Ben Asher and Ben Naftali. Ben Asher says it's Yissachar, like the Mincha Shai. Ben Naftali says it's always Yissaschar. But if you say Yissaschar till Pinchas, and you say Yissachar after Pinchas, you're not like Ben Asher, and you're not like Ben Naftali. Who are you like? Like nobody. You're your own man. You're in no man's land. And therefore it's wrong. Furthermore, says Reb Shlomo Zalman Hena. Now listen to this. You guys all know what a shvana and a shvanacha is, right? I know, this is your favorite subject. A shvana is when you have a shva. You know what a shva is? 2 dots under a letter. Sometimes you could pronounce it I. It moves like bi rachis. Or sometimes it's sort of silent and it rests like Yisrael. Not Yisrael, Yisrael. Right? You don't say Yitzchak, it's Yitzchak. So sometimes the shva moves, shvana, sometimes the shva rests. in the Art Scroll Siddur, they give you a little signal on the top of the letter when you pronounce it, when you don't pronounce it. Okay. Says Reb Shlomo Zalman Henna, if you're going to pronounce the second sin, is it a shvana or a shvanach? Yissaschar or Yissaschar? If it's a shvana, Yissaschar, then the first shin should have a meseg. And there's no tikkun in the world that has a meseg under the first shin.
What's a meseg?
A little line underneath for emphasis. And if it's a shvanach, any shva, nach, that's followed by a beged kefes letter. Now what's a beged kefes letter? Beged kefes, beis, gimel, daled, kaf, pei, taf. These are the 6 letters in Lashon HaKodesh that could have a dot in it. The rule is, any beged kefes letter that follows a shvanach always has a dot in it. So if it's a shvanach, it's going to be Yissaschar. And therefore, you know how we know you don't pronounce it? Because since it can't be a shvana, and it can't be a shvanach, it can't have any nukudas. And I know you were all bothered by this question also, right? In other words, is it a shvana or a shvanach? This would be the only shva that is not a decisively shvana or shvanach, and therefore it says Reb Shlomo Zalman Henna, it is impossible to say that sometimes you pronounce it, sometimes you don't pronounce it. And therefore, says Reb Wolf Heidenheim, that the words of the Nachlas Yaakov are empty. He says, Al tishel devei chaloimos, don't be swayed by his dreams. Kulam yisaruach, anyone who doesn't silence the second sin should be carried away by the wind. And then he's very critical of Nachlas Yaakov. He says, the truth is, the Nachlas Yaakov, La yada me'inyan hakriya hanachayna kol me'uma. He didn't know anything about how to read. So as you can imagine, by the way,
Can't the Shin have enough dot in it?
a Shin,
Could have a dot in it.
but it's not one of the Beged Kefes letters that would be subject to these rules. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think the dot would be a dogish indicating that it really should be 2 shins. In other words, the dot would not in the shin. Yeah, but I'm not 100% sure. Okay.
Too many letters, like where
Oh, Teimani.
and Dalet.
Okay, yeah, Dalit, yes. But regarding Teimani, you should know that in the Sephardic world, there's no such thing as Yissaschar. Nobody ever said such a thing. It doesn't exist, that pronunciation. By the Teimanim, nobody ever said Yissaschar. But right now, as the Shiur stands as of now, there seems to be this practice of the Nachlas Yaakov, that you say Yissaschar until Pinchas, and then you drop it, and this is based on the Taz and the Chizkuni. However, the Medaktikim say it's not a legitimate approach to reading. It's a nice drush, but it does not affect the practical halach of how to read from the Torah. Okay, that being the case, there is a great Medaktik alive today who actually learns in Koilel Chazoinish. And his name is Reb David Yitzchaki. And Reb David Yitzchaki argues that it is absolutely impossible to say al pi dikduk that it's pronounced anything other than Yissachar, and that's because there's no shva under the sin, there's no kamats under the sin, there's no dad on the left hand of the sin, there are no nukudas at all. It's because it's a Greek sieve. By the Teimanim for 2,000 years, there was no havamin of saying it any other way, and they have the purest Masar in terms of reading. By the Sfardim, they don't read it any other way. And then he gives a shocking statement. Say, yeah, but I've been in places where they say Yissaschar. He says that's not like Ben Asher. Ben Asher says it's always Yissachar. Ben Naftali says it's always. So let's find out, what does Ben Naftali say? The Kamarna writes, the Kamarna wrote a parish on Chumash called Heichal Bracha. Kamarna was from the Gedoyle Mikubalim and the Oil Machasidas. His opinion is you must pronounce the other sin like Ben Naftali. You know how he writes to pronounce it? Yissachar. Yissachar. The first sin has the shva. The second sin has the kamats. Meaning, he writes that if you want to pronounce 2 sins, the first sin is a shva, yis, and then sachar. And who says Yissaschar? Nobody ever said it. Not Ben Asher, not Ben Naftali, and not the Gedolei Chasidus. But that's usually what you'll hear people, in many shuls, they'll do. We'll see what they do very soon. But the Rav David Yitzchaki says that to pronounce the sin, if you want to pronounce it, there's only one way to do it. Yissachar. Because that's what the Kamarna writes based on the psak of Ben Naftali. In other words, like this. We already saw the Mincha Shai Paskins and the Radak Paskins that we always follow Ben Asher. Following Ben Asher would mean Yissachar. The other opinion is Ben Naftali, you always say 2 sins. But even within 2 sins, as we're going to see in number 28 and 29, look at number 29. Li Yissaschar hakriya nechayna kedas Ben Naftali, the Heichal Bracha says, right? So this is the opinion of Gedolei Chasidus, that you follow Ben Naftali, you always pronounce the 2 sins. But Harishain B'Shva, the Hasheni B'Kamatz is number 29. V'kach Nohag Moiri V'Rabbi Doidi Rabbeinu Tzvi. That's what my Rebbe Rabbeinu Tzvi did. Who's Rabbeinu Tzvi? Reb Tzvi Hersh Mizadachov. So, the most ancient customs are like this. Ben Asher, it's always Yissachar. Ben Naftali, it's always 2 sins. How 2 sins? Yissaschar. Those are the 2 based mahalchim, of which we know which is more correct. We know without 2 sins is more correct. That's what we follow. But now we come to what the practice is. And the Chassam Sofer, in the Torah's Moshe, in this week's Parsha, back to number 23, the Chassam Sofer says that there are 2 sins in Yissachar. One to denote that Leah rented Yaakov. One to denote that Hashem was rewarding Leah. And the first reason we want to cover over, but, says the Chassam Sofer. So really, then it should come out, you should always say Yissachar, like Ben Asher. No. But the first time you say it, you should pronounce the 2 sins. Why? Because otherwise you're not going to know what his name is. You're not going to know what you're covering over. So the Chassam Sofer writes, the first time you pronounce the sin, the second, and from there on, you don't pronounce the second sin anymore. Now, the Chassam Sofer, this is when he's born. When he's born. Now, interestingly, the Chassam Sofer doesn't say that you say Yissaschar. He just says you pronounce both sins. But we already saw, if you want to pronounce both sins, it's Yissachar. And that Kamat nobody does, except for the Talmidei, Kamarna, and Zidachar. But that's really the only way to do it. It's either Ben Asher or Ben Naftali. Now in Poland, every Baal Koirei did Yissachar, without exception. That was the minhag in Poland. And Rabbi Yehuda records that, until he got to Prague and he saw some places they were pronouncing it with 2 sins. But the Chassam Sofer is writing that in his location, the custom was the first time, so that we know what his name really was, to pronounce the first sin. By the way, in Minhagei Chassam Sofer, it's also brought down. The minhag Chassam Sofer was the first time the name was read, you pronounced 2 sins. Again, now, it doesn't say Yissaschar, it could be Yissachar, but at least you pronounce. So we have 3 minhagim so far. We have the minhag based on the medaktikim, which is the most correct al pi dikduk, and that is you never pronounce the second sin. It's a kriik siv. You have the minhag based on the nachlas Yaakov, which is very much rejected by the medaktikim, and then you have minhag Chassam Sofer. By the way, Rabbi Yosef Shaul Halevi Natanzan, the Sholem Eshev, writes in his commentary to Chumash Divrei Shaul that even though all the medaktikim say you don't pronounce the sin, the first time you should do it, and we're not halachically bound by what the medaktikim write, which is an important principle, because as great as all these medaktikim are, and even if they're right, it does not impose halacha. It doesn't have the force of halacha. It may be wrong not to do it, but it might not be halachically wrong not to do it. And therefore, the Divrei Shaul writes that in 1856, he personally told the Baal Koirei to read it with 2 sins the first time. Now again, he didn't say to read it Yissaschar. He very may well have said Yissachar. That we don't know. No. But clearly, one thing I want to tell you is, never say, I saw in the Sefer B'nai Yissachar. Because then your mamish and Amaretz Gomor. Right? I want to tell you that. I heard in the Sefer B'nai Yissachar, guy,
The wrong guy.
how much, you don't have any Hasidic blood in you, you know? So, we do know that the B'nai Yissaschar himself did read it Yissaschar. Okay, we do know the B'nai Yissaschar himself did read it that way. Oh, we have it on the sheet number 30. Number 30, he says, the Rabbi Stern in the B'tzalel Chachma, he says, V'chein shamati b'shem Hagon HaKadosh, Baal B'nai Yissaschar, likroi lo'elam Yissaschar. So that's not like Ben Asher. That's not like the Nachas Yaakov. That's not like Chasam Sofer. That's like Ben Naftali, which the Kamarna also says it's always. But again, the Kamarna says it's Yissaschar. It would be rather ironic if the B'nai Yissaschar held to read it Yissachar, and his real name is, I read in the Sefer, B'nai Yissachar. But let me get his name correctly. One of the greatest medaktikim, Rabbi David Yitzchaki of Koil Chazonish, he says that there's a simple reason why, even though if you're going to read it as two sins, they changed it from Yissachar to Yissaschar, and that is, it's a tongue twister to say Yissachar. It's impossible to say. So what happened was like this. Those who wanted to follow Ben Naftali realized, look, we want to pronounce the second sin. The first sin already has a nakuda. So they read the first sin, Yissa, and now they're stuck. What nakuda we should put on the second sin? They say it's probably a shva nach, and that's why there's no nakuda there, because it sounds the same whether there is or there's not. That mistakenly led to pronounce Yissachar as Yissaschar. Okay.
Who's number 30? Rabbi, who's he?
Number 30 is Rabbi Tzalel Stern.
And what,
Where are you?
in 30.
30.
But,
It's a mistake, probably.
What does it mean that he heard it?
He heard.
Time?
No, he heard from a guy who heard from
But
his
he said,
Zayda.
"V'chein shamati."
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. That means it's anecdotal evidence, and you can't really. That's what you're saying. You heard. It's a report. It's a report. Okay. Mav Rabbi say. So we have so far Yissachar, which seems to be, based on the laws of grammar, the most correct way. You have the minhag of the psak of the Ben Naftali, which is followed by the Kamarna and the B'nai Yissaschar, which is to read it Yissachar, always. You have the pshat of Nachas Yaakov to drop it at Pinchas, and you have the minhag of Chasam Sofer to drop it after the first one. What was very surprising to me is Rav Moshe writes, the minhag is, like the Chasam Sofer, to pronounce it the first time. The first time you say Yissaschar, and after that you drop it. By the way, so you say, so what do you do in this shul? Because I'm always following Rav Moshe, but not here. Because Rabbi Yaakov argues on Rav Moshe. Now, in Inyonei dikduk, this is a very interesting concept, idea, that even though we always pass like Rav Moshe, but when it comes to Inyonei dikduk, Rabbi Yaakov is considered the master of dikduk. The MSI, Rabbi Yaakov wants to say, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, I even called Rav Mordechai Kamenetsky today. I said, what did Rabbi Yaakov say? So he was a smart man. He said he never heard. Okay? So,
Not like this turn, yeah.
but the Emes Yaakov quotes the Messiah. The Messiah is what the Baal Turim is based on. The Messiah says explicitly, which should make it the final word, that Yisas Yud Sin Chaf Reish is always pronounced Yissachar, including here the first time. He writes that black and white. The Messiah is the earliest of the Messiahim, of the earliest of the Balei Dikduk. That's what the Baal Turim is on. Baal Turim is a sefer on the Messiah. Messiah writes, if you look at number 37, Kasav b'Messiah, Kol Ayraisa Train Shinin Ksivin v'Loi Karyan. It's written and not read. Va'afilu Dain, even this one. Now listen to this. Rabbi Yaakov wants to bring a raya to Minhag Chasam Sofer. What's the raya? Because it says in the Gemara in Saita that when the word Yissachar was spelled on the Choshen, we know we had to have a certain number of letters, and it was spelled Yud Sin Chaf Reish. And the Gemara says, why was it spelled that way? Kisol Doisam, the way their father called them when they were born. So that's mashma, says Rabbi Yaakov, like Minuk Chasam Sofer, that at least the first time you read it the way Yaakov called him, which is Yissaschar. But, says Rabbi Yaakov, at the end of the day, the Messiah writes openly that even the first time you write Yissachar. So therefore, if you don't know what to do, that seems to be the most correct, unless, of course, you have your particular minhag. Now, Rabbi Yaakov has a bumba of a kasha on all the other pshatim, right? Many of the pshatim say, drop it after Parshas Pinchas because Yissachar donated a sin, or drop it after the first one because it's embarrassing. Rabbi Yaakov says you forgot a pasuk in Divrei Hayamim. In Divrei Hayamim, there's a man, no relation to Yissachar, named Yissachar. He's spelled Yud Sin Sin Chaf Reish, and everyone pronounces it Yud Sin Chaf Reish. So what does that show you? That the medaktikim are right, that you just don't pronounce two sins in a row. Because if it was a special reason that he donated the second sin, or it's an embarrassment to the second meaning, that doesn't apply to the other guy. What, the other guy also had a son Yoiv? He also was tortured in school? He also donated a second sin? Or the second Yissachar also was rented by his wife and was also given a zilpah? I mean, this man presumably has no connection to the original Yissachar. Therefore, Rabbi Yaakov says that would be a strong question on this other approach. In Yeshiva Torah V'das, they do as follows.
Named after Yissaschar, and that's the way they do it. That's the first precedent of all time. In other words, everyone stems from those 12 names.
So he's named after him.
The guy's named after Shevet differently. In other words, that's
so why does he spell again?
It's like Abraham, for whatever reason,
right?
Just changing it because he's got that's the first class of the Yissaschar.
So he's named him after the original name.
Yeah.
But how is he pronounced?
Well, that's like circular. We're in the same boat, but at least it's the same class of the Shevet.
So look, if he donated the sin, so then
it's over. Yissachar's over. That's the way we're pronouncing it forever.
Yissachar. So why is it written two sins then?
It's never going to change.
It's not going to change. It's going to. So he named it with the same Greek sieve as the. Right. Interestingly, in Yeshiva Torah V'das, the minhag is they take out the Torah for Parshas Vayeitzey, and they read it like this: V'ataroid v'atelein bein v'atikra shemai Yissaschar Yissachar. Now, who is that like?
Nobody.
Nobody.
They're wrong. Where did it come from?
You're adding on a word. Either you read over the pasuk differently.
It's not.
I don't know why. That's what it's brought in the Sefer Minhagei Yeshiva Torah V'das.
Yeah.
The Stipler said,
Adding
If
a
I may,
word to the
yeah.
Why don't you read over the whole pasuk? Like Zeicher Zachar, but you just can't add a word.
No, it's probably like it's a correction. In other words, Yissaschar, token, but you should know that's not how we really pronounce it. Like, they correct themselves. I don't know, I'm sure they, Yisudasa Maharei Kodesh. The Stipler said, the first time you should read it, Yissachar, Yissaschar. So he asked the Stipler, Yissachar, Yissaschar. He said, yeah, that's how he grew up in his shul. Now, Stipler, he said he grew up by Hasidim, and that's how they read it. Lamaisa, these are some of the minhagim of the pronunciation. But again, the opinion of Ibn Ezra and the Radak and the Mincha Shai and Rav Menachem di Lonsato and Rav David Yitzchaki and the Razah, Rav Zalman Hena, and namely all the medaktikim in history go like Ben Asher. Minhag Chasam Sofer is the first time it's Yissaschar. Minhag of the Shalom Eshiv, the first time is Yissaschar, and you have various variances of this reading. An interesting pshat brought in the Makar Chaim. He says, you know why you take two shins and you take away one? Because we know Yissachar learned, but he had a partnership with Zevulun. So he has two schars. One for him, and the lack of pronunciation of the other one is he takes the second shin and he gives it to Zevulun, and he says, share the schar with me. This is the pshat of the Makar Chaim. But Baruch Hashem, tonight we've been introduced to a number of great personalities, namely We've been introduced to Ben Asher, Ben Naftali, Rev Yedidia Shloimeh Nortzi, the Minchashai, Rev Meir Alevi Abu Lafia, the Ramah, and Rev Zalman Henna. And all of these great Chachamim are Chai V'Kayam, should be Malitzei Yisharim, Lanu L'Chol Yisrael, Amen.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.